Again, if you get the right people in the right roles, and it's not the smartest people, it's not the hardest working people, it's the people who, this constellation of attributes that you're looking for that you think are right for you and your organization at this point in time, match up to that. Don't ever, ever lose sight of why you do what you do. And that's to bring forward innovation for patients because they need it.
Every once in a while, I come across a story that reminds me why I started this podcast. Not just a company, not just a leader, but a mission so clear, so urgent that it pulls science out of the lab and into the lives of people who are running out of time.
The culture and the values are really important. They're likely different from one company to the next. I think there's some similar themes, i.e. this patient-centricity theme, but it's critical that you have those and that you can communicate those and that you can live those.
This is one of those stories. Right now, there's a company called Fibrogen doing some of the most boundary-pushing work in oncology and anemia. They're not chasing buzzwords or headlines. They are focused on something far more meaningful, building potential first-in-class medicines for diseases that don't wait: metastatic and locally advanced pancreatic cancer, chemotherapy-induced anemia, and resistant prostate cancers where options are painfully few.
You got the patient that is served by, ultimately, does the drug provide a good benefit risk profile for an individual patient? You got the regulators who ultimately determine that if that is the case.
But what makes Fibrogen different isn't just the science, it's how they're doing it by leveraging body's own natural pathways to fight back, not just treating symptoms, but challenging the biology of these diseases at their root.
Fibrogen had been the innovator in a new category of anemia products. The category was called HIF-PHIs. It ultimately led to the achievement of the Nobel Prize for Medicine and Physiology in 2020 as well.
And at the helm of that mission is a man I've come to deeply admire. Thane Wetting is the CEO of Fibrogen. He's the kind of leader who brings steadiness in the storm and clarity in a world that often rewards chaos. Today we talk about science, yes, but also about resilience, leadership, risk. What's your advice for biotech leaders trying to find their way right now?
Have belief in what you're trying to do, right? Have belief in your science, have belief in your team, have belief in what you're trying to do on behalf of patients.
Before we jump into today's episode, I just want to say something from the heart. Over 93% of the people who watch this podcast regularly haven't subscribed. And listen, I get it. Life is busy. You click, you watch, you move on. But if you've ever felt like this show brings you value, if it has made you think, sparked a new idea, introduced you to something inspiring, then I have a small favor to ask. Please hit that subscribe button. It might not seem like much, but to me, it means everything. This podcast has always been a labor of love. No sponsors, no script, just honest conversations with people trying to make a difference in the world of healthcare. And your support, your one click, helps me keep doing that. It helps more people discover these voices. It helps this community grow. So if you're here, if you believe in this, please consider subscribing. Thank you for being here. Now let's get into the episode. Every once in a while, I come across a story that reminds me why I started this podcast. Not just a company, not just a leader, but a mission so clear, so urgent, that it pulls science out of the lab and into the lives of people who are running out of time. This is one of those stories. Right now, there's a company called Fibrogen doing some of the most boundary-pushing work in oncology and anemia. They're not chasing buzzwords or headlines. They are focused on something far more meaningful, building potential first-in-class medicines for diseases that don't wait: metastatic and locally advanced pancreatic cancer, chemotherapy-induced anemia, and resistant prostate cancers where options are painfully few. But what makes Fibrogen different isn't just the science. It's how they're doing it, by leveraging body's own natural pathways to fight back. Not just treating symptoms, but challenging the biology of these diseases at their root. And at the helm of that mission is a man I've come to deeply admire. Thane Wetting is the CEO of Fibrogen. He has led blockbuster drug launches, global commercial strategies, and now biotech company in one of the most complex chapters of its journey. He's the kind of leader who brings steadiness in the storm clarity in a world that often rewards chaos. Today, we talk about science, yes, but also about resilience, leadership, risk, and what it takes to bet your career on doing something that really matters. Thane, welcome to Drug Diaries.
Yeah, thank you, Kaushik, and thank you for those kind words. I'm not sure I'm deserving of them, but I appreciate the opportunity.
Of course, it's a pleasure to have you on Drug Diaries, Thane. I've been waiting for this moment for a while, so I'm very, very pleased and delighted to have you here.
Glad to be here.
Uh, right. So, Thane, before we get into the specifics of Fibrogen and your leadership, I want to start with a broader canvas. Can you share your career journey with our audience and the key milestones that led you to your current role at Fibrogen?
It started, back in the late '80s. It's a long time ago, probably before many of the viewers of your podcast were even born. But I went to school in St. Louis at Washington University and got an undergraduate degree in biology because I was very interested in the life sciences. I think at one point in time, I entertained the notion of going to medical school and being a doctor, but that changed about halfway through my undergraduate studies. But I so thoroughly enjoyed the life sciences, and I was doing a part-time work study program, working in a couple of different labs at the medical school at WashU in St. Louis. And when I finished my undergraduate biology degree, it seemed just like a likely next step for me to continue that basic research path. And so that's what I did. Helped an individual who was just starting out in his lab. He was the chief resident in the Department of Pathology at the WashU School of Medicine, a guy named David Lacey, and David ended up leading discovery and early stage development at Amgen later on in his career. And so I had the opportunity to basically help him set up his lab, and we started just the basic research, and it was primarily in the area of bone and mineral metabolism. I had, not a lot of experience in bone and mineral metabolism and, didn't know a lot about helping somebody start their lab and undertaking initial work in support of a grant that they had received, but I did it. And so about the second year into the work, I was enjoying it, but I also realized that research is not the fastest paced thing in the world, right? Especially basic research where you're doing an experiment, learning from that experiment, and then figuring out how to design the next experiment that would hopefully build upon the learnings that were obtained in previous experiments. And so it wasn't as exciting as I needed it to be for my own person, but I really enjoyed the life sciences. I enjoyed the pursuit of answers and the creation of hypothesis and either proving or disproving that particular hypothesis. And so what I thought would make sense to complement my life science background and the initial experience that I had was to go back and get a master's in business with the express purpose of then trying to start a career in the biotech, biopharma, pharmaceutical industry. And so that's what I did. I went back to WashU. I got a master's in business. It was a 2-year full-time program. The first year, I continued to do research in the lab while I was undertaking my business studies. And then at the end of that second year, knowing that I wanted to work in the biotech or pharma industry, I had a number of different opportunities with a number of different companies, and ultimately was fortunate enough to accept an offer with Eli Lilly and Company based in Indianapolis. A lot of things went through that kind of decision pathway, but I think the main reason that I chose Lilly as opposed to some of the other opportunities that I had was really more values driven. I'm from the Midwest originally. Lilly is a Midwest company, and the values and the culture just really resonated with me. And so I started my career at Lilly in 1990. I was on a kind of a marketing associate pathway. The first role that most of the marketing associates undertook when they joined Lilly was in retail sales. And so I was actually out calling on physicians in their practices. And I was based in New Orleans, had a territory in the city itself, a couple hundred physicians kind of on the call list. And it was just a great way to get indoctrinated into how physicians make treatment decisions and then how you can support them in those treatment decisions based upon your portfolio of products. And so I did that for 2 years, thoroughly enjoyed it, more so than I thought I would. And then the track after a sales experience was then to go back into the home office. So I'd gotten married by that point in time. We moved to Indianapolis. I had a couple of different experiences in this kind of rotational program. The first was in our corporate business development group. And so although I was hired into a marketing associate track, then my first experience in the home office was in corporate business development, which I really didn't have any kind of clue about. what that particular function or group, what their remit was. But I quickly understood that it was really about the inbound and outbound of technology products, of assets, to either complement what we were doing internally with our discovery research and development efforts, or to out-license technology that was no longer as important to Lilly as it may be to somebody else. 18-month experience, and to me, it was foundational for a number of the roles that I have had subsequent to that. But I never would have guessed that that was the case. After that 18-month assignment, I then moved into our U.S. operations and was in a role where we were, in essence, redefining the commercial organization within the Lilly U.S. affiliate. And long story short, what we ended up doing through that particular project, where I was working with a senior director who was reporting right to the head of the U.S. operations, is they were really trying to transform how we approach the customer. I think from being, more of a kind of a internally driven, product centric culture or organization to very much a customer first organization. That then led to the reorganization of our U.S. operations. We created 8 distinct businesses across the United States, gave that senior director in charge of that particular geographic area the entire authority and the accountability for achieving results in that particular geography. Previously, we had these sales sleeves that they overlapped with one another, and there was some commonality of products and some not commonality among products, but it led to just kind of a hybrid, kind of matrixed approach to the customer. We just didn't feel that if a customer were designing our organization, that's how they would design it. So when we went to these 8 distinct geographic areas, we staffed the areas with some analytical capability in the form of what was called an operations manager. And so I was able to move into one of those operations manager roles based in the southeastern part of the country. And I moved down there and did that for a couple of years. And then that allowed me to segue into a sales leadership role. So I was a sales manager in charge of 15 or 16 people also in the southeastern part of the country, which was my first real kind of leadership experience. So you go from maybe leading 1 or 2 people within an internal kind of staff role to all of a sudden being thrown into the lion's den, leading 15 or 16, mostly career sales representatives. And it was not only a great experience, but it stretched and it grew me unlike I could have ever imagined. And we were able to achieve great results in that sales experience. That then led me back to Indianapolis, where I took over the marketing team that was responsible for Lilly's insulin franchise. Lilly, and working for the University of Toronto in the early 90s, was largely responsible in assisting the University of Toronto from scaling up from what was discovered by Banting and Best in Toronto in terms of the insulin that was extracted from the pancreas glands of pigs, to then be able to make that commercially available in large scale, so that not just a couple of dozen people could benefit from insulin therapy, which was before then a death sentence to type 1 diabetes, to then make it in commercial scale and really make it available to the world. And so fast forward from the 1920s to then the late 1990s, and we were still the market leader in insulin therapy, and it was a really important business for our U.S. operations. And so I had the opportunity to lead the marketing team for a few years. Then I got the opportunity to move over to our German organization with a staff role, where I was responsible for a number of the functions in support of the business. So reporting to the affiliate general manager, and I had new product planning, market research, sales training, sales operations, forecasting, things of that nature. And it was a great personal experience. It was a great professional experience as well, just being able to see how another healthcare system operated and how an affiliate like Lilly operated within that healthcare system, and how an affiliate like our German affiliate operated in the context of the broader Lilly organization. And I had the opportunity to work for 2 different general managers with very different leadership approaches and very different experiences as well. So it exposed me to a couple of different leaders that I was able to learn from and grow and develop underneath as well. I then moved back to Indianapolis, took over another brand that had recently launched and had not gotten off to a good start. So they were trying to replace some of the parts on the team. And so it was a product for severe sepsis, which until then really had never had a product that was approved for severe sepsis. Did that for a couple of years. And then I moved into a role leading the global marketing efforts for Lilly's diabetes portfolio. And at that point in time, in addition to insulins, we had an oral agent that we had in licensed in collaboration with a Japanese firm called Takeda. And then we also had a number of different business development initiatives underway, along with some internal development. So it was the opportunity to really manage a portfolio of assets, both in market assets as well as assets that were in late phase clinical development, with the hope of that they ultimately would make it to market and benefit patients with diabetes. And that was in 2004. And so from 2004 until 2018, when I left Eli Lilly and Company, I in essence was in the same role, but it was a markedly different role over time. Not only as we transformed the way we operated internally from a research and development and commercialization perspective, but really the transformation of Lilly's diabetes portfolio and diabetes business from being an insulin company with an oral agent to then being, along with Amylin Pharmaceuticals, the originator of the GLP-1 receptor agonist therapy area, to then a really important alignment and agreement with Boehringer Ingelheim for some important diabetes assets, to the launch of Lilly's once weekly GLP that ultimately was brand named Trulicity, which ended up being a $7 to $8 billion product, the largest product in Lilly's history, and then to putting tirzepatide into phase 3 development. So making the bet on tirzepatide, that was the bet that we were going to make for not only diabetes, but for obesity as well. And then the opportunity came to leave Lilly through an early retirement program that they made difficult to say no to, if you know what I mean. And then that led my journey on the small side, on the biotech or the pre-commercial path of my career. I went to work in Boston for a company called Intarcia Therapeutics as the chief commercial officer. We had a drug device combination product in phase 3 development. It was what's called an osmotic mini pump. So you placed it under the skin in the abdomen, and it had a product called exenatide in it. Exenatide was the first GLP-1 receptor agonist that Lilly and Amylin had launched together. It was off patent by that point in time. And so there were some scientists that came up with a way of turning the highly potent peptide into a formulation that you would put in a small osmotic mini pump, place it under the skin in the abdomen in an in-office procedure, and have the GLP product work for 6 to 12 months at a time to largely mitigate against some of the challenges associated with adherence and compliance with a chronic treatment for a condition like type 2 diabetes. Unfortunately, we got the second complete response letter in support of that product, and the commercial team that we had built up, we had to let go. And so, which also meant that the chief commercial officer had to find a new role outside of Intarcia, which is what led me to Fibrogen, which is where I am now. I was able to join Fibrogen in June of 2020, so shortly after the onset of COVID. And my former boss at Lilly, Enrique Quinterno, who had led really the transformation of Lilly's diabetes business with a kind of a core group of senior leaders, including myself, had left Lilly at the end of 2019 and had joined as the CEO of Fibrogen in 2020. I had reached out to him looking for a reference after my Intarcia opportunity had ended. He provided me a reference, and he sent me a note afterwards and said, "Hey, I started a search for a chief commercial officer role. Would you be interested in being a part of that search?" I immediately said yes, just because of how much respect I had for Enrique as a leader, as an operational leader and a strategic leader. And so it ended up that I was able to get the offer for the chief commercial officer role at Fibrogen in the middle of 2020. And then about 3 years after that, so the middle of 2023, and we can talk about this more later as we talk about the evolution of Fibrogen's portfolio, we had a phase 3 failure. Enrique chose to leave at that point in time. There were a couple of internal succession candidates, myself and the chief medical officer. They selected me to then take over the CEO role on an interim basis, and then a couple of months later, they asked me to step in on a permanent basis, which I gladly accepted. And here we are a couple of years later, part of the still working on, I think, toward the tail end of the transformation of Fibrogen from a company that was initially focused on antifibrotic approaches to different conditions to now, as you said in the introduction, Kashik, a company with a really exciting asset for metastatic castration-resistant prostate cancer, a companion PET imaging agent for that antibody drug conjugate focused on MCRPC, and then also a product that we have approved in more than 40 markets that we now think we have a path forward in the US for a condition called anemia of lower risk myelodysplastic syndrome. So it's been a remarkable journey. I can't believe it's been 35 years since I started that journey at Eli Lilly and Company in 1990. Not only have I learned so much, but I think I've been fortunate to work for some amazing companies, some terrific leaders, and have been able to, I think, along the way, chart my own course from a leadership perspective and for what works for me. And so here we are. And again, I appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts.
Oh, that's absolutely spectacular career trajectory, then. So impressive. You've seen it all.
I've seen a lot. I don't think I've seen it all yet because I'm still seeing some things in this role. But no, and I think that's what makes things exciting, right? Is it's
Yeah,
just not the same old thing day after day after day.
exactly. And then your transition from big pharma to biotech isn't just about company size. It often involves an entirely different mindset. In biotech, there's less infrastructure, more volatility, and often more personal risk. So, what was the adjustment like for you? And what did you take with you from big pharma? And what did you have to let go of?
That's a great question. When I was interviewing at Intarsia, I think one of the most important questions that I was asked is, how do you know you can make the transition from big pharma to a pre-commercial focused, hopefully more nimble biotech company? And I'm not sure you really know the answer to to that question until you actually are able to get into a role and you see how there are similarities and how there are differences. I heard from the HR leader at Intarsia, his perspective, and he'd been at big companies and at small companies as well. And he said, the mindset really is, if it's to be, it's up to me. And I think, at Lilly, I led a pretty large global marketing organization. I think at its peak, there were probably 70 or 75 people in that global marketing organization focused on Lilly's diabetes and obesity business. So then coming into Intarsia with a commercial group of probably 8 or 9 people. And so it was one of those things where you had to roll up your sleeves. You just couldn't, be a part of kind of a senior lead team, and then you set the strategy and then you go about the execution of that strategy, which we clearly did it. But I was much more involved in not only the setting of the strategy, but also importantly, the execution of that strategy. And a lot of the brand development efforts that we were working on, which we're hoping that was in anticipation of an approved product where we could ultimately introduce the brand to customers, but that didn't happen. But anyway, I think that as I reflect on my time at Lilly, and I think about large versus small, and I hope this is kind of getting at the question that you've asked. I'd say that, there are some similarities. We're trying to help patients, right? And that doesn't change if you're working at a company like Lilly or if you're working at a company like Fibrogen. At the end of the day, the patient should be at the center of every single thing that we do. They are our most important stakeholder. There are other important stakeholders, shareholders, employees, et cetera. But at the end of the day, the patient is the most important stakeholder in our journey. And we have to always keep that in mind. That doesn't matter what company you're at, and big or small, mature or a company that has just started. I think also one of the things that struck me about working at a small company versus a larger company is the I think at a company like Lilly, you're surrounded every day by so many incredible, smart, talented people. When you go to a smaller company, you get the same degree of brilliance, but it's in a more focused and concentrated organization as opposed to being around literally dozens or hundreds of people that you walk away from and you go, wow. So I think it's probably there's a depth of talent versus the breadth of talent at a company, a large company, at least from my experience at Lilly versus Intarsia or Fibrogen. And I think another thing that I found to be very similar as well is that the culture and the values are really important. They're likely different from one company to the next. I think there are some similar themes, i.e., this patient centricity theme, but I think that there also are going to be some sometimes subtle and sometimes not so subtle differences in terms of the culture and the values of an organization. But it's critical that you have those and that you can communicate those and that you can live those, because those ultimately are in support of the patient, the true north about how we're trying to ultimately serve the patient.
Right. And stepping into a CEO role, especially during a time of scientific transition and organizational recalibration, is no small feat. It's a moment that tests clarity, decisiveness, and empathy. How did you approach that leadership transition, and what were your first priorities?
Yeah. So I never had the opportunity to meet Tom. So let me give you a little bit of a historical perspective on Fibrogen. Fibrogen was founded in the 90s by an individual named Tom Neff. I never had the opportunity to meet Mr. Neff. He passed away, unfortunately, in the fall of 2019, which is what led Enrique Conterno to Fibrogen and what led me to Fibrogen in the middle of 2020. In 2020, when I joined, Fibrogen had been the innovator in a new category of anemia products. The category was called HIF-PHIs, and it ultimately led to the achievement of the Nobel Prize for Medicine and Physiology in 2020 as well. So it was a novel way to ultimately treat anemic conditions. The product had been approved by the time I joined in China and Japan. It was under review by the FDA in 2020 with a PDUFA date toward the end of the year, and it was also under review in Europe. Fast forward, it's approved in Europe. So it's approved in Europe, China, Japan, and about 40 other countries. Complete response letter in the US, which was really a hit to the company. The license holder at that time was AstraZeneca. We were in support of AstraZeneca in all of the regulatory interactions and ultimately in some of the pre-commercial activities as well. But the product received a complete response letter from the FDA in August of 2021. AZ, as a license holder, then chose not to invest any additional resources behind it. They kept the license for a few years, and here we are in 2025. Product was still available in 40 plus countries. It's done remarkably well in China, not so well in Japan and in the other markets where Astellas is the license holder. In China, Fibrogen and AstraZeneca have a joint venture with the brand. And so it's just a wonderful product. But in 2021, when we got the complete response letter, that led to a pivot to another phase 3 asset that we had at that point in time called pamrevlumab. And pamrevlumab was in 3 different phase 3 programs, one for idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, another for Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and a third for pancreatic cancer. Fast forward a few years after that, and unfortunately, pamrevlumab misses an IPF in the May timeframe of 2023. The market value of Fibrogen at its peak was about $5.5 billion. It was about $4 billion when we received the complete response letter for roxadustat in the US. Took it from $4 billion down to about $2 billion. And then we had the IPF failure with pamrevlumab in May of 2023 and took the market cap from $2 billion down to about $200 million. So a significant reduction in market value simply because of what was being counted on. When pamrevlumab failed its phase 3 trial in idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, we stopped the other phase 3 IPF trial because there was no way that we'd be able to get regulatory approval with a failed trial and a successful trial. Enrique chose to leave at that point in time, and then I stepped in. At that point in time, we had about 325 people in our U.S. organization. We went from 325 through a reduction in force down to about 210 or so. I subsequently decided that we needed to stop our discovery research programs because I just felt that the value inflection opportunity for stakeholders was just so far in the future that our investments were better spent in other areas that had an opportunity to create more near-term value. So we then, when we stopped the discovery research efforts and with some subsequent attrition, we went from about 210 down to about 180. And then when the last phase 3 program for pamrevlumab failed, which was for pancreatic cancer, we then had another reduction in force from 180 down to about 50, and that was in August of last year, so about a year, almost exactly a year ago. During that point in time, we had in-licensed an asset from a company called Fortis Therapeutics. This was an antibody drug conjugate with a novel target and an antibody against that target, combined with what's called an MMAE payload that's part of an antibody drug conjugate complex. It had really interesting phase 1 data, and so we in-licensed it and ended up continuing the development of that particular product. We call it 3246. We don't have a USAN name for it yet, and so we're working on that, but it was formerly called FOR 446. And again, it had really, we thought, really interesting phase 1 data in monotherapy for metastatic castration-resistant prostate cancer, a radiographic progression-free survival of 8.7 months, which we thought was really competitive. It also has a companion PET imaging agent associated with it that hits the same antigen with the same antibody. And so if you think about the way that prostate cancer is treated today, there's this castration-sensitive phase, and then most, if not all men, unfortunately, transition to the castration-resistant phase. You see these products called androgen receptor inhibitors used much more so in the castration-sensitive phase, and then as the men transition to the castration-resistant phase, There's a new product. It's a radioligand from Novartis. It's been out a few years called Pluvicto. There's also a companion PET imaging agent. It's called PSMA PET that is provided by a couple of different companies, Lantheus, Telix, Novartis has one as well. And so in order to be prescribed the radioligand Pluvicto, the individuals have to undergo a PSMA PET scan and be positive for the PSMA antigen. Pluvicto is a blockbuster product. It'll probably do $2 billion in revenue in 2025. And so as patients transition to that castration-resistant phase, they would typically switch from one, what they call ARSI or androgen receptor signaling inhibitor, to another. Wouldn't get a lot more bang for the buck, maybe 3 or 4 months of additional RPFS. And then they'd go to chemo. And then Pluvicto, which was indicated after chemotherapy, Pluvicto now has just received an additional indication in that pre-chemo space, which is exactly where we're trying to go with our ADC, is post-ARSI, pre-chemotherapy. And we are on the verge of starting a phase 2 trial, monotherapy trial, with our ADC and our companion PET imaging agent. And so that's where we are. We've continued to whittle the organization down. I think we're perfectly sized for what we need to be at this point in time. We're about 40 people in the US, and we are really excited about the opportunity to start a phase 2 trial in a condition that unfortunately has no cure. Prostate cancer is the second leading cause of death of men in the United States from cancer, the first being lung cancer. And these therapies will prolong survival, but they do not provide a cure, unfortunately. And so what you find is that many men, as they transition from the castration-sensitive phase to the castration-resistant phase, they're going to want to try multiple treatment options, and they're going to want to try to put up chemotherapy for as long as possible just because of the toxic side effects associated with chemo. And so there continues to be a profound unmet need, and we think a product like ours, it doesn't target PSMA, it targets a unique antigen on the surface of prostate cancer cells called CD46. We think our YS5 antibody targeting that particular antigen, if we see results in the phase 2 trial like we saw in the phase 1 trial, we think we've got a pretty interesting asset to contemplate then taking forward into phase 3. And so that's where we are.
Right.
We've got one other asset that we are having conversations with the FDA about. It's roxadustat, a product that's approved in China, Japan, and 40 other markets. They got the complete response letter for anemia associated with chronic kidney disease. We are now hopefully on the pathway to starting a phase 3 trial in anemia associated with lower risk myelodysplastic syndrome, another condition, an orphan condition with a substantial amount of unmet medical need. There are some approved products, but patients either become resistant to those products or don't respond. And so we're hopeful that we're going to be able to take roxadustat into a phase 3 trial here in the coming months with the guidance from the FDA on our phase 3 protocol. And it's, again, another asset that we're really excited about. So as we've kind of tried to complete this transformation from a large, high-value biotech company in the late 20 teens to early 2020, to really a transformed company that's focused on an oncology product for prostate cancer, which you referenced at the outset, a product for potential phase 3 start for anemia associated with lower risk myelodysplastic syndrome. So we could be looking at, a year from now, being in a phase 3 trial for roxadustat for low risk MDS and being in a phase 2 trial with FG3040 for metastatic castration resistant prostate cancer. And here we are, as we think about that market cap or that valuation from, $5.5 billion down to $2 billion, down to $200 million. We're sitting at a market cap right now of about $30 million. The good thing is we've got a cash runway that takes us into the second half of 2027. So we believe we've got at least the substrate and the bandwidth that will allow us to advance the ADC for prostate cancer and see what the phase 2 trial looks like.
Right. I'm going to ask you a very silly question, and pardon my ignorance. Just wanted to understand the nuances or the difference between castration-resistant prostate cancer versus castration.
Yeah, it just has to do with the stage of the actual tumor and what it expresses, and importantly, what it responds to. The standard therapy at the outset of the diagnosis of prostate cancer, if in fact it's diagnosed in the castration-sensitive phase, is androgen deprivation therapy. So they're trying to reduce the testosterone as much as possible. Ultimately, patients transition into this castration-sensitive phase where Testosterone isn't, testosterone levels aren't the issue. But what you're seeing then is these patients often become metastatic. And so it goes from being localized in the prostate to then spreading to other tissues and in fact often to bones as well. It's a horrible, horrible condition of prognosis for patients when that happens. Unfortunately, some patients don't get diagnosed until the castration resistant phase and until it's actually metastasized. There's a pretty easy test that a man can get, and most men do get when they undergo their annual physical. It's called a prostate specific antigen or a PSA test. And there's certain levels above which the clinician becomes concerned, below which you're viewed as normal. Unfortunately, there are a number of people who remember men who go years and years and years without getting a PSA exam or PSA test run as part of just their normal lab workup. But yeah, that's you got the sensitive phase and the resistant phase. The longevity for somebody who's diagnosed in the castration sensitive phase is years and years and years. It's a very slow growing tumor. But if unfortunately it does transition to the resistant phase and becomes metastatic, the prognosis at that point in time is very poor. And you'll see, for instance, Pluvicto had in the most recent results in this post androgen receptor signaling inhibitor therapy, but before chemotherapy, they had a radiographic progression free survival number of 9.3 months, an overall survival of 20 or 22 months, median overall survival. So you can see that once it hits that castration resistant phase and becomes metastatic, the prognosis is really poor. But no, that's not a silly question at all. And I think I got it mostly right. I probably missed it a bit, but hopefully
I
close
think that
enough.
was very well explained. Thank you. Thank you for taking time to explain that. Another question, often new CEOs feel the pressure to shake things up, but sustaining what works can be just as important as changing what doesn't. So, what were some things you knew you wanted to preserve at Fibrogen, and what did you feel needed reimagining?
Yeah, I think the engagement level that we had with the entire organization. So we would run these annual engagement surveys where we try to understand how were people feeling about the company, how confident were they in our future, how confident were they in leadership, how confident were they in our science, and it allowed us to reflect on where are we in pretty good shape, and then where are there some gaps that we would need to kind of go to work to try to close some of those gaps. And one of the things that we had learned through the course of that those surveys was that people were highly engaged and confident in our future. They had really gravitated to our core values, which Enrique actually put in place when he stepped into the organization. Coming from a company like Lilly, which Enrique and I both came from, Lilly was founded in 1876, and they still have the same corporate values today that they had almost 150 years ago. When Enrique walked in the doors of Fibrogen, there was not a core set of values. And so one of the first things he did was he charged employees with coming up with the set of values that he felt, were going to be in support of that true north of that patient centricity. And so we had established that, and I think we'd gotten a really good acceptance of those core values. And so I wanted to make sure that people understood that we're not going to, just because there's a change in the CEO and we've had a couple of knocks against us, it doesn't all of a sudden call for a change in the values or our mission or the vision of the organization. And so I wanted to make sure that people understood that we're going to continue to treat these core values as integral to our organization. One of the things we learned through that engagement survey was that there was a feeling that there were a number of people within the organization that probably didn't have the capability that we thought that we needed. Fibrogen had been around, like I said, since the 1990s. And one of the things that struck me when I stepped into the organization was how long many of the people had been at Fibrogen. And I was used to that at Lilly, right? I mean, people had been at Lilly for years and years and years. It's not common for a biotech company, especially a company that had no products approved, to have the kind of tenure associated with it. Now, on the one hand, loyalty, I think, is a great thing, right? But loyalty, if you don't have a performance driven organization, is not a real good recipe for success. And I think it was Enrique's view, and it was my view, that there were a number of people that if we were starting the organization over from scratch, we wouldn't select them on the team. We're looking for A players. And so what we attempted to do, what Enrique was doing and what I continue to do, was to ensure that we've got the most capable people in the right roles. And so it wasn't really a change, but it was a kind of a continuation and kind of an acceleration of what we had been doing. And then I think a key change that I made that I alluded to a little bit earlier was the shutting down, unfortunately, of the discovery research organization, just because the time from where we were at preclinical assets to then being able to file INDs and to start clinical trials that would ultimately lead to a perspective of, did that particular approach hit or did it not? That the length of that work stream was just far, far too great given who we were at the time, which was, needing to transform and focus. And because of that decision, we then no longer needed our lab space in the Mission Bay area in San Francisco. And we had a forward lease obligation that really could have crippled the company. I think we had a forward lease obligation of 80 or $90 million. And if we would have had to either stay in that building, utilizing just a fraction of the capacity, being able to sublet some of the lab space, but nowhere near all the lab space that we had, but continue to then pay those monthly lease payments, that could have really grounded the company. So we were able, thankfully, to negotiate and out on the lease. And this was about probably 15 months ago or so. And thankfully, we were able to do that. And so we were able to get out of our lease. And now we've gone to a fully virtual company. We're primarily in the Bay Area, but a number of us are spread out in different locations. And so it's also forced us to ensure that we can get the most out of our people and our teams in a remote setting, in a virtual setting, as opposed to kind of in an in-person setting as well. So, a number of things that I tried to kind of hold on to, but some important kind of changes that we felt like we needed to make. And I think if you look at our kind of our leadership team now, when I took over, we had 9 SVPs plus our head of China operations, plus myself as the CEO. Right now, we have myself and the head of China operations, and those are the only lead team members that are left when I took over. And we've been able to bring about a half a dozen people up from that next level of leadership into key leadership roles, not as complex of an organization now that we had then, but an opportunity for these individuals to step up, to grow and develop their own leadership skills, to lead functions themselves. And I got to tell you, I'm really excited about the team that we have in place.
Right. Thane, you mentioned one of the most promising areas in your current pipeline is the phase 2 ready ADC, antibody drug conjugate for metastatic castration resistant prostate cancer, a disease that's notoriously aggressive and often eludes standard treatment. And what makes this even more compelling is the companion PET imaging agent that's being developed alongside the ADC. And the convergence of diagnostics and targeted therapy represents the next wave of precision oncology. How does the imaging agent fit into your broader oncology strategy?
That's a really important question. The development of the CD46 PET imaging agent has lagged the development of the YS5 antibody, which is combined with the MMA payload that forms the antibody drug conjugate complex. But it's an incredibly important part of it. And the landscape has been fairly well informed by Pluvicto and then the companion PSMA PET imaging agents, where, like I said earlier, it's in the label for Pluvicto that in order to be administered Pluvicto, the individual has to be treated with the PSMA PET imaging agent, scanned with then positive PSMA lesions. And so we're basically trying to run that exact same play, albeit with a non-PSMA approach, which we think is really important for us because there are a lot of companies that are focused on PSMA as the approach for prostate cancer, but we know that there are a number of antigens on the surface of prostate cancer cells, CD46 being one, PSMA being another. Then there's STEAP and TROP2 and a few others. But for what we're trying to do with the CD PET imaging agent is to ensure that in our phase 2 trial, where we're going to treat 75 patients, 25 at each of 3 different doses, is everybody's going to be treated with the CD46 PET imaging agent, not as a prognostic biomarker or diagnostic to say who expresses CD46 versus who doesn't. It's going to be an all-comers population. And then what we're going to be doing throughout the course of the open label trial is to assess on an analytical basis the degree of expression of CD40 as measured by the CD46 PET image, and then be able to do a correlation assessment as we go through the course of the trial and look at PSA 50 results, look at ORR, look at RPFS results to see if there's a correlation between the expression level of the target or CD46 as measured by the PET scan and the response to the ADC. Hypothesis being, higher you express CD46, the better you're going to respond to our ADC that targets CD46. And if that, in fact, proves itself out, what that will allow us to do in the phase 3 trial is to use that as a diagnostic criteria for entry into the trial. We do know that probably 70 to 80% of patients express CD46 as part of their prostate cancer. Probably 85 to 90% of patients express PSMA. So there's a lot of overlap between the two.
Yes.
We also know that there are patients who express CD46 that don't express PSMA. But what we would like to try to understand is there a correlation between the response to our ADC and the expression of that target as measured by the PET scan? And if so, enrich the phase 3 trial with the higher expressors of CD46, because we're then confident that we would get a better response, or the patient would get a better response to than the ADC. So that's the role that the CD46 PET imaging agent is playing in our phase 2 development.
Right. So you mentioned that roxadustat is now approved in over 40 markets, including China, Japan, and across Europe. And that kind of global expansion requires not just regulatory agility, but also cultural and commercial fluency. What have been your biggest learnings from scaling a product like roxadustat across such diverse markets?
I'm not going to try to overplay the role that Fibrogen has played in the commercialization of roxadustat in the Astellas territories, right? So Astellas has rights in Japan, Europe, a number of the Commonwealth states, Middle East, South Africa. And so Astellas is really the commercialization engine behind roxadustat in those markets. We do have a joint venture with AstraZeneca in China, where in 2024, the brand did more than $340 million in sales. So it has performed really, really well. I'm also not going to try to speak for our incredibly talented head of commercial operations in China, Christine Chung, because she has been there since the outset of the formation of the affiliate for Fibrogen in 2014, the relationship with AstraZeneca. Maybe what I could speak to is, going back to my days at Lilly and helping to lead the launch of brands on a global basis. And then also in the relationship that Lilly and Boehringer Ingelheim had in support of Tradjenta, which was a DPP-4 inhibitor, Jardiance, which is an SGLT2 inhibitor, and then a basal insulin that came from Lilly into the relationship. And I think that one of the most important parts for the marketers, who might be listening to the podcast is that we had the goal of creating a global brand. And that's not just a global brand, one brand name globally, but really a global brand in terms of what does the brand stand for to customers, to patients, as well as to healthcare professionals, as well as to payers. And it takes a lot of discipline to do that, because ultimately what you find is you have a lot of very talented people at the local level who kind of want to put their stamp on a brand and say, well, the global team didn't get it quite right because our market's a little bit different. And so what we attempt to do from a global marketing perspective is ensure consistency from one market to the next. That doesn't mean that we're not going to take into consideration differences that might occur from one market to the next. But I can tell you that there are a lot more similarities across markets than there are differences across markets, because at the end of the day, it's a patient with a condition that you're trying to make better. And it's a clinician who ultimately makes the diagnosis and then is trying to make the right treatment selection to make that patient better. And so I'm not sure it really takes kind of agility. It really takes a consistent approach. You want to make sure that you've got an outside in perspective, not only an outside in with respect to patients and healthcare professionals, but also an outside in perspective as it relates to your affiliate colleagues who know their market better than we know it. But at the same time, we want to make sure that that consistency is applied, because we think ultimately that's what's best for the brand. And by doing what's best, for the brand, we think we can help more patients at the end of the day. I don't know if that helped or not, because it really didn't get at the exact question you were asking. Because
You did answer that.
yeah, I'm not going to pretend to be knowledgeable about Astellas and then our China operations the way that some other people are.
All right. No, I think that was very helpful. And then there's always a delicate balance between scientific ambition and commercial realism, especially when managing investor expectations, regulatory timelines, and real world patient needs. How do you personally balance those forces?
It's very different stakeholders, right? You've got the patient that is served by, ultimately, does the drug provide a good benefit risk profile for an individual patient? You've got the regulators who ultimately determine that if that is the case. And then you have stakeholders who want every project and every asset to be successful, right? As we all do. But that's not a realistic expectation. So how do you balance it? I think the one thing you want to do is you have to worry about those things which are under your control, and then let the chips fall where they may. Ultimately, this is a data-driven business, right? You can't turn a bad drug into a good drug, right?
Yes.
But with some sort of a fancy clinical trial design. The drug, the data, it has to stand on its own, both in terms of the benefit it can provide, but also in terms of the adverse event profile. And then it has to be, priced in a way that clinicians are willing to prescribe, patients are willing to pay whatever their out-of-pocket might be, and the payers, either in the fragmented ecosystem of the US or the single payer system of many other markets, are willing to reimburse at a price that the company is willing to accept. On the investor side, I must say that that's probably the greatest learning I've had coming into this role as CEO. I'd had a lot of exposure to investors in previous roles, but I'd never been at the tip of the spear from an investor perspective. And I can say that for many investors, their return window is much, much shorter than the typical drug development timeline, right? They want to know something sooner rather than later. Not all investors. Don't get me wrong, there are some investors who have a long view of things and are in it for the long term. Um, and it's not that we would shy away from investors with a shorter window. But I think what you end up finding is that many of these investors, there's been a change over the past kind of 4 or 5 years. Many of these investors are wanting to discharge as much risk as possible before jumping in. I think in the kind of the COVID area, maybe 2019, 2020, even into 2021, there were investors who were funding a lot of good ideas, but without concrete proofs of concept. Now they're not only wanting a concrete proof of concept, they're wanting solid phase 1 data, and in many cases, really good phase 2 data, because it's really not until you see the phase 2 data where you think you've discharged a significant enough risk to maybe want to jump in with a big investment in a particular company. And so I think maybe that those are a bit of the differences, the dynamics that you have to try to manage, because drug development is such a 2 or 3 year game. It may have chapters that are 2 or 3 years long, but it's a much longer game than that.
Yes.
And some investors are along for the ride, and others have a shorter window of opportunity that they particularly look at. And that, I think, has led to an evolution over the past few years of investors really wanting to discharge a lot more risk than they were needing to discharge a few years ago. And I don't blame them, right? I'd probably be operating in the same way myself.
Exactly. That's the nature of our business, unfortunately.
Certainly is.
All right. And then we are living through one of the most cautious capital environments biotech has ever seen. IPOs are rare, mergers and acquisition activity is slow, and the investor sentiment is at best selective. How are you navigating the climate as a CEO? And
Yeah.
how do you keep the team motivated through it?
Yeah, well, we most of the team gets shielded from kind of the capital dynamics. We keep them informed, but they aren't necessarily involved. We want to keep them focused on the great work of bringing the product through the development pathway. No, I think what part of it is how clear is your strategy, and how effective is your execution. I think at the end of the day, investors pay attention to a few things. They pay attention to your science, to the data in support of that science. They pay attention to the strategy that you are attempting to employ. And then they look at your leadership team and the talent of your leadership team and their track record of performance. That's what we try to point out. We try to be really consistent with our messaging. You can't fool investors, right? You can't, you can't tell them a story that you can't back up. You get in trouble doing that. But I think that investors are, like I said in the answer to the previous question, Kashik, investors, they want to discharge as much risk as they possibly can these days. You see that, to your point, with the dearth of IPOs most recently. There still is money to be employed or deployed. There's no question about that. There still is a lot of capital. I was about to say good ideas will get that capital. I think good ideas with proofs of concept and with data in support of that will get the capital. But it's harder to come by than it was previously, because I think you've gotten a risk aversion just based upon a lot of big bets that were placed that didn't end up paying off. And I think you see that with large pharma companies and the deals that they're doing with smaller biotech companies as well, is they're being more selective. And um, you sometimes hear about the successes. X company made Y acquisition, and this product is a result of that particular acquisition. I think you're also hearing a lot about X company made Y acquisition for $1.2 billion, and this was the platform that they purchased, or this was the asset that purchased, and they now have shelved it. But I think that that's just the nature of the of our industry, right? This is a high risk, high reward industry. It's not for the faint of heart by any means, and there are going to be some bets that pay off, and there are going to be some bets that don't pay off. And yeah, I think that's just the nature of what we do.
And another question for you, Thane. There's been a lot of noise lately around FDA budget cuts and slowed review cycles. But your experience seems to defy that narrative. Can you share your perspective on the FDA's responsiveness and what you've observed through your recent interaction?
Yeah, I certainly can. And this is an N of one, right? So I'm sure that there are perhaps people who are going to see the podcast, or others who would say, I've got a completely different experience. I think in the past, probably 4 or 5 months, we've had six important regulatory interactions, where we have asked to reactivate an IND for roxadustat in the US in support of low risk myelodysplastic syndrome, that we filed a Type C meeting request for roxadustat for that same condition, where we had the Type C meeting with the FDA, where they provided us commentary back, the formal minutes, where we activated an IND for our PET imaging agent for FG3246. So there have been about half a dozen really important interactions that we've had, and not only have they kept to the timelines, but in a few cases they beat the kind of the mandated timelines. So yeah, I would say that based upon our experience, that this rhetoric around, boy, the agency is in turmoil, that so many of the staff have left, it's going to impact drug development timelines. At least from our experience, that has not been the case. I think what we see is there's still a dedicated group of people at the FDA who understand, why they do what they do. And for the two assets that we have and the half a dozen regulatory interactions, things are on schedule.
And then you made a great point in our earlier discussion. Investors and acquirers today are much more focused on discharging risk before making decisions, and the bar has moved. What does that shift in investor and acquirer behavior mean for biotech companies like Fibrogen, and how do you respond to that reality?
Hope that you have enough cash that you don't become desperate, right? And so, if you are in need of raising capital and you aren't in a position of strength, or you don't have leverage, it's going to cost you, right? You can raise the money, but it's going to be very expensive capital to raise, and you're going to dilute your current shareholder base in a significant sort of way. So I think that the most important thing is trying to raise money when you don't need it. You hear that often. When's the best time to raise money? Is when you don't need it, because then you're not at the mercy of the people who have the money. And so again, I think it also comes down to making sure that you've got a very clear story. Here's what your strategy is. Here is when we are going to see data. Here's what we hope to see with that data. Here's what it will then mean. People have their own valuation models. We know what our internal valuation model says, that if the phase 2 trial for FG3246 and the companion PET imaging agent is positive, we know what that does in terms of a value inflection. We also know the same thing with roxadustat. If we're able to start a phase 3 trial for low risk MDS, investors have their own models and they look at that, and they're continuing to try to understand, at what point would I invest in a company where I think that, yeah, I'm getting a good deal, or I have the potential to not only hit a single or a double, but to hit a home run. Um, or even in their cases, maybe a grand slam. And so you just have to be, I think you have to be patient. On our side, we just have to be patient. You can't, unless you are really desperate, you just need to continue to kind of hold the line, and hopefully have a data point or two that can create a value inflection for you. Because if you can create some value inflection points based upon data, your access to capital at an acceptable rate is going to be much, much greater than, again, if you're kind of back on your heels, you need the money, you don't have any catalysts. And if you do have catalysts, they're not going to be as meaningful for you from a valuation perspective as they could be if you were in a more stable or advantageous financial position.
Right. Then I'm going to ask you some philosophical questions. From global pharma boardrooms to scrappy biotech hallways, you've seen this industry from every angle. Looking back, What's something you wish you had understood earlier in your career?
Boy, that's a really deep question. I tell people the story that when I was coming up through the Lilly organization, I'd see an opportunity, I'd spot a problem, but I would automatically think that at my level, if I know about that opportunity or if I see something that needs to be changed, surely people at higher levels within the organization also see it. They've been here longer, they're smarter than me, they're at higher levels within the organization. And what I found over time is actually the opposite is true. I think people who are in the trenches, who are doing the work, they see things that other people at higher levels don't see. And I think it's really incumbent upon individuals as they're coming up through the organization that if they see an opportunity to bring it up, if they spot a problem, to think about how that problem can be solved. And that if they don't like the response that they're getting, to continue to raise it until either somebody responds or tells them that they're not going to respond. And then you can go about, perhaps, spotting a different opportunity. And I've seen it a number of different times. And it's just one of those things where don't expect others to see things the same way you do. And if you think you see something in a certain way that other people need to know about, you need to be vocal about it in the right way, in a constructive way. But don't just automatically assume that if you spot something that there are half a dozen other people who see exactly the same thing and are going to do something about it.
Very well said. Then, if you could have a 5-minute conversation with a 20-year-old version of yourself, what would you say?
Trust your gut. Don't rely on data for everything. I'm more analytical than I am less, and I tend to kind of let data help me make decisions. And it's not to say that I would have had the intuition at the age of 20 that I have at now at the age of 60, but I think that you can only analyze certain things so much, and you ultimately have to kind of trust your gut and go. And there are a lot of times where good enough is good enough, or having enough data to make a decision is enough data to make a decision. And waiting for that extra piece, just really at the end of the day, is not going to enhance the quality of that decision that really needs to be made. And then, I think the other thing that I would say is enjoy the ride. I think many of us are so kind of consumed with wanting to do such great work and being consumed with the role or the task at hand or the deliverable that maybe sometimes you put off some other important priorities that, when you look back now, you say, well, it was pretty important. And you know what, if I had to do that over again, I wouldn't have missed, that particular event, or I wouldn't have necessarily made that trip because I really need to be there. And so I think that's probably the other piece of advice. But I do think this younger generation, I've got, 3 kids in their late 20s or early 30s. I think they get it. And they didn't get it because I told them to get it. I think they get it because I think just things have naturally evolved. And so I'd give that advice to myself over again. But I'm not sure that same advice needs to be given as broadly today as perhaps it needed to be, 25 years ago.
And many emerging leaders today are navigating complex trade offs, personal values, risk, speed, and burnout. Your perspective would mean a lot. What's your advice for biotech leaders trying to find their way right now?
Yeah, I think you've got to have belief in what you're trying to do, right? Have belief in your science, have belief in your team, have your belief in what you're trying to do on behalf of patients, and be optimistic about your chances. Don't wear rose-colored glasses too often, right? You don't want to be too optimistic, but at the same time, you want to try to paint an optimistic picture for all of your key stakeholders, especially the people who are doing the work on a daily basis of trying to bring innovation to patients so that patients can live longer, healthier, more sustainable lives. And so I think that would be to me a really important point is to make sure that you've got an appropriate dose of optimism that is grounded right in what you're trying to do. And also don't try to paint a picture that you just know is going to be a reach. I think people have gotten in trouble by overpromising and under delivering. And I'm not saying that you need to under promise and over deliver. I think you set the right kind of expectations, both internally as well as with your external stakeholders.
Right. What's a personal value or philosophy that's guided you through the highs and lows?
I think probably I'm going to tell a little bit of a story, and it gets to an experience I had when I was part of the kind of the senior team at Lilly, where every year the top 150 people in the company got together, and we would talk about the corporate strategy and the various things. There was an individual who spoke to us by the name of Jim Collins. And for those, I'm sure a lot of people are kind of nodding their head when they listen to this podcast. Jim Collins is an unbelievable leadership authority. Has written books like Good to Great, Built to Last, Why the Mighty Fall. One of the things that he said, which just it struck me unlike anything ever has, just kind of sitting in a room listening to somebody tell their view of the world. He said that in the work that he and his researchers had done, where they looked at literally thousands and thousands of years of corporate history and corporate performance, what they were trying to understand is what differentiates a really good company from a sustainably great company. And these really good companies are really good companies that have been around for a long time and have produced outstanding results, but there are a handful of companies that just are sustainably great. And he said every single time it came back to this concept of what he called who's on the bus. And what he means by who's on the bus is it's your number one priority as a leader is to get the right people with the right capabilities in the right roles, both the what and the how, right? But he kept saying his mantra was before what, it's who, before what, it's who. And if you get the who right, your ability to get the what right is magnified substantially. And so that was something that and when I heard that, it wasn't one of those things where it was like, well, wow, I never would have thought about that before, but to hear it with the clarity that he spoke to it. And so it's something that I have paid a lot of attention to. And I don't always get it right. I wish I could say I'm batting 1,000, but I'm clearly not batting 1,000. But if you get the right people in the right roles, and it's not the smartest people, it's not the hardest working people, it's the people who, in this constellation of attributes that you're looking for that you think are right for you and your organization at this point in time, match up to that. And if you get that right, boy, you can make beautiful music together and you can create an epic organization that I think can create great results.
Right? That's profound.
No, it didn't come from me. I just regurgitated. I wish he'd pay for me, but I did.
But you explained it so well. It resonated deeply with me.
Thank you.
And then, before we end our today's conversation, is there a message or perspective you would like to share directly with the industry?
Don't ever lose sight of why you do what you do. And that's to bring forward innovation for patients because they need it. And it's no more complex than that. Just don't lose sight on ultimately how we create value for people. And how we create value for people is by helping patients in a way that current therapies or approaches don't do enough. And as long as you keep that kind of front and center and you deliver on that, I think the stakeholders around the edges are going to be well rewarded.
That single minded focus on the purpose is incredibly powerful and inspiring.
Certainly is.
Right. And that brings us to the end of our today's conversation. Thank you not just for the time today, but for your honesty, your clarity, and the kind of leadership that doesn't chase the spotlight, but earns respect through consistency, humility, and depth. It's easy to talk about science in terms of pipelines and endpoints, but what you've reminded us today is that behind every molecule, every clinical milestone, every hard decision is a human story, a story of purpose, of resilience, of leadership that doesn't just react to the world, but shapes it. And what Fibrogen is building, the science, the culture, the intention, it matters. And your role in stewarding that forward isn't just impressive, it's meaningful. And I've learned a lot today. I know our listeners will too. And thank you for showing up, not just as a CEO, but as the person behind that title. Thank you so much, Thane.
Kaushik, thank you for the opportunity. And I hope I provided some insight that at least some people will be able to kind of nod their head to and perhaps act on as well.